Hello, and welcome to the Natural State Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Anthony Gustin. It is my belief that the natural state of any living organism is health, and that our artificial habitat has forced us into having artificial health problems. This show is my attempt to dive deep and learn about using nutrition, sleep, movement, relationships, and more to help you reclaim your natural state of health in a modern world and show you how to thrive in an environment that's stacked against you. If you enjoyed today's show, you can find out more details and information at dranthonygustin.com. Today we have Zach Bitter joining us on the show. Zach is the world record holder for 100 miles. He ran this on a track and then also just kept on running and set the world record for a 12-hour run as well. This guy is an absolute animal. So I love chatting with anybody who holds world records or is the peak of their game. And just so happens that Zach uses a low-carb ketogenic approach in his training to stoke his metabolism and get the most out of his body. It could have been whatever. I just find it fascinating that he uses nutrition specifically to fuel his races and found it works for him. So we chat about his nutrition, his training programs, as well as his mindset. I mean, how can you possibly just work through a 100-mile race, 12 hours of running on a track, and not go crazy? I don't know. I asked Zach these questions. He answered them. He's an amazing human. So tune in, and I hope you enjoy. Before we get into today's episode, I wanted to tell you about how you can directly support the show. It is not free to produce this podcast, and I don't want to use the typical model of selling your attention to sponsors to fund the show. I want you to be able to take all of my health recommendations seriously without wondering if I'm being paid to promote something to you. If you want to support the team that is behind this podcast, head on over to either one of the brands that I've founded at perfectketo.com or equipfoods.com. I've developed the products for each of these companies with my insanely high standards because I couldn't find them anywhere else. Perfect Keto offers everything you need to support a whole foods-based ketogenic diet, from exogenous ketones to help you transition into keto and boost your energy, to super clean collagen bars that have been tested not to spike your blood sugar. It's literally the only bar that I know of that won't, and that's why I made it. Over at Equip Foods, we take real food ingredients seriously. You'll find only whole food ingredients like beef protein powder, sweet potato powder, grass-fed liver capsules, and more. If it's your first time trying the products at either one of these brands, use code NATURALSTATE for 20% off your first order. And if you feel amazing focusing on 100% real foods, awesome. These products are intended to support a proper foundation of health and nutrition, and they're not magic pills. All right, enough of that. Let's get into the show. Zach, thanks for being on the show, my man.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So you are a unique human being. You have very special capacities and world records. So maybe just start by talking a little bit about that and your background and sort of what you do for a living.
Cool. Yeah. Unique's a nice way of putting it. And so I guess I got into running when I was really young, and then kind of through that experience of running in high school and college.
Track and field? Or?
Yeah. Track and field, cross country were kind of the ones that I would focus on for sports mostly in high school. And then when college came around, I thought, well, if I'm going to be in class, I may as well be doing some running in the process. So talked to the cross country coach at University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point and kind of figured out what I had to do to kind of get on the team and stuff like that. And that's when I started to really, I think, dive into running as a sport and look into kind of just the process of getting fit for certain distances and things like that. And I identified that the long run was kind of my favorite workout through that experience. So after college, I just started more or less doubling down on that for a while. And that kind of led me to ultra running. And ultra running is kind of what I've been doing mostly for the last, I guess my first one was in 2010, and then I waited a year to do a second one. But then after that, it was basically all training and peaking for ultra distances.
Okay. And for people who don't know what ultra means, what is the formal definition of that?
Yeah. So basically it's assumed, or kind of the 50K is kind of the entry more or less for most folks, where, I mean, technically anything over a marathon would be an ultra marathon, but 50 kilometers is usually kind of that entry point. And then basically anything above that, and you get some really crazy stuff. There's a race over in New York where they run, I think it's like 3,100 miles or something like that over the course of like the summer, and they have.
It's not a relay?
No, it's not. They have it's unique in that they make you take a break, so you can't just like kind of dictate your time frame. You have to take, I think it's 8 hours off every day from a certain time frame, and then it's and it's on like a half, just like it's a little over, I think, a half mile loop around this park in New York, and keep grinding it out.
You
So,
just go over and over and over. I thought it was
Yeah.
like maybe upstate New York and you're in this nice
No,
path.
they're not getting that much scenery there.
Wow.
So yeah, there's all sorts of stuff. There's a race over in Morocco called the Marathon des Sables, where it's a stage race. You're running through like sand dunes and things like that, and then you get timed events like what I've been doing quite a bit of the last few years, where you're on a 400-meter track, seeing how far you can get, and then you do trails and stuff like so there's a lot of ultras kind of out this way in California. Western States 100 is a big one out this way. Up in Northern California, San Diego 100's another one. So you can get the kind of the beautiful areas too.
So, I mean, how did you sort of go into this? I mean, what is your sort of specialty now? Is like 100-ish mile, 12 hours, 10, 12 hours? Like, where's your sweet spot that you found?
Yeah. 100 miles is the one I kind of gravitated to, I guess, more or less. And I think that's more of just the culture. It seems to be kind of this interesting distance to the ultra running community in North America. So a lot of folks are peaking for that distance.
Why is that?
I don't know. It's a good question, actually. I think maybe when the sport kind of had its last big kind of uptick, which would have been like maybe about 10 years ago or a little over 10 years ago, a lot of focus was put on the Western States 100 and some of these like iconic 100-mile races. So then when people started hearing about the sport, their first point of entrance was a lot of times, reading about those races. And then people, I guess, decided, hey, I want to try to run one of those. And then they'd use like 50Ks and 50 milers and things like that as stepping stones towards that. But it is interesting because if you go over to like Europe, they don't really care about the 100-mile distance that much. They've got races that end up being about 100 miles, but they're more about just, here's this really cool route, let's race it. And whatever it ends up being, it ends up being.
Right. I'd say more.
Yeah. When you're running that far, it shouldn't really matter when you're getting down to.
Right. So why don't you talk about, so what I have here is that you, in your second race, you had a very specific thing happen. Like, so what happened when you started doing these distances? So you did one, and then the second one, you broke the American world records. Is what happened?
Not my second ultra. It would have been my second 100-miler.
Okay.
Is when I broke the American record in
so
2013.
You were already doing pretty long distances.
Yeah. I'm trying to think how many. I'd probably done probably about a dozen like ultra marathons, mostly like 50-milers at that point.
And then were you like, what's the gap between training for a 50-mile race versus a 100-mile race? Is it just more of the same?
No,
or
it's different. Yeah, it's different. I think like the 50-mile, the way I like to describe is if you're like a really good like marathoner, you're probably going to be a pretty good 50-miler as long as you can like just alter your training a little bit. The biggest hurdle will be just how well you respond to the type of course you're going on. So that's the other big variance. Like I do a lot of flat runnable stuff, but there's also like really technical, steep climbing and descending type stuff that just is a skill set you have to learn. So like as long as it's not overly technical, like if you're a really solid marathoner, you probably be a really solid 50-miler. 100 miles is getting into that distance where it's almost like a different skill set. It's not to say you can't be great at the marathon or the 100-miler, but there are different things that kind of close that gap and make it a little more fuzzy, I guess, as to how you're gonna, be at that. I would compare it kind of, you get like 5K, 10K guys in track and field. Sometimes they don't always translate out to be really good marathoners. And then sometimes you get really good marathoners who just aren't really that good at 5K, 10K. So
that's just like a body type and genetics and
I think there's probably
systems and stuff like that.
Yeah, there's probably just a durability standpoint when you're going that long, being able to put the training in and then handling it. There's a big digestion type kind of component where you have to be able to manage fueling and be able to execute a fueling strategy so that you're staying on top of things. And then I think there's just like a different mental component to like being able to keep pushing when you're out there for that long. And that kind of adds a new kind of unique variable that maybe skewed a little bit differently for 100 miles versus shorter distance stuff.
So the second 100-mile you ran broke the American record.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then the world record came soon after that.
I wouldn't say soon, but so in 2013, I broke the American record for 100 miles and the world record for 12 hours. So distance run in 12 hours.
And do those usually go sort of hand in hand where it's like, screw it, if I hit 100, that's great, but I'm going to run for 12 hours and we'll see what I can do.
I mean, there's not a whole lot of people who've done it. So it's just not a lot of like, I think it is like for anyone who's finishing their 100-miler under 12 hours, it does seem like a pretty logical move to stay out there and see what you can get for 12 hours. There's a lot more people who would do a 12-hour and they wouldn't hit 100 miles in that time frame. So that you have to be fast enough in order to kind of have that opportunity. And from the American standpoint, there had only been one other American who had gone under 12 hours for 100 miles before I did it. And his name is John Olson. He squeaked under. It was like 11 hours and 59 minutes. So it gets just like a really kind of small pool of people at that point. But yeah, when I did that, my next thought was like, well, I wonder what the 100-mile world record was. And then I kind of made it a point to try to target that for the next few years.
And then targeted you did, huh?
Yeah. It's kind of funny. I envisioned myself breaking it like that next year, but it took me about 6 years to finally do it. So
what is that 6 years like? I mean, is it changing your fueling strategies? Is it changing your nutrition, your recovery? Is it just training harder? Like, what were the sort of inputs that changed to allow you to sort of access this new level?
Yeah, I would say when I broke the American record for 100 miles in 2013, that's when kind of my fueling, I had switched to a high-fat, low-carb diet, or like kind of a periodized version of that at the end of 2011.
So you were doing the same amount of racing before with doing sort of a higher carb, sort of traditional endurance?
Yeah, I never done a 100-miler on a high-carb approach. I'd switched before I'd done my first 100-miler, but I had done... I would have done 4 50-milers on a high carb approach before kind of switching over. Mostly just because I felt like what I was doing didn't feel really sustainable with the training and racing. But I was new enough to the sport where I didn't want to kind of scale back if I didn't have to. So I started looking nutritionally first, and that's when I kind of came across like Volek and Vinny's type of research. And
so you were just sort of exploring and found it, and then you said, "Screw it, I'm going to change everything and flip it upside down and see what happens."
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of a curious person, so I like to think about that stuff. But what ultimately kind of really drove it was when I think it would have been when I was training for some of those races in 2011. I was looking at how much I was actually running, and I was a full-time teacher at the time. So I was like, okay, I'm putting in upwards of 20 hours a week training. It's like, this is almost a part-time job at that point. And you start feeling guilty about how much like time you're, I don't want to say wasting, but like spending doing any one activity. So I was thinking, well, how can I kind of make that more productive? So I started listening to a lot of podcasts while I would run. And that's when I kind of started just checking out podcasts that had to do with running. And then it came across, I can't remember which podcast it was, the first one. It might've been maybe Endurance Planet or one of those kind of earlier endurance podcasts that were kind of talking about kind of a high fat, low carb approach. And that's kind of what piqued my interest in it. Then I just started reaching out to people who had been interviewed about it or had been talking about it and kind of figuring out if there was a place for that in ultra marathon.
Okay. And at that time, were there many people doing it? Is it pretty rare?
Yeah, certainly in the ultra marathon world. I think maybe one of the first guys that had been playing around with it a little bit before me would have been Tim Olson, who he kind of shot up in fame, I guess, in 2012 and 2013 when he broke the course record at Western States 100 and won it 2 years in a row. So he had been playing around with a kind of a version of a high-fat, low-carb diet. And so he was kind of an interesting one in terms of looking at someone who was racing really well on that. So it kind of flew in the face of you need carbs to perform type of a thing, because here we have the most competitive 100-miler in North America, and he's breaking the course record there using a fueling strategy of limited carbohydrate consumption. So he was an interesting one. I think we probably started kind of playing around with it in parallel with one another. He was just way more well known than I was at that point in time. And then it took me probably about 2 years to start feeling really comfortable with it, where I felt like now I kind of have a process of, I feel great doing everything running wise. Like I feel really good on my easy runs. I feel really good on my long runs. I know what to do to really nail some of these higher intensity workouts, which was probably the piece of the puzzle that took me a little longer to figure out. And then, so then in 2013, after I'd been doing it for a couple of years, I think I had a protocol that was close enough to what it is today that allowed me to kind of run that 11:47 for 100 miles. And then it was just kind of continuing to like learn that, like implement that, put in a ton of training with that. And this last fall was when I broke the world record for 100 miles with a pretty similar approach.
Congrats, man.
Thanks.
So obviously there was a transition period. of, figuring out what strategies work for you.
Yeah.
And what were sort of the adaptations? Was it an energy thing? Was it timing? I mean, what was that transition period like for you?
Yeah, at first it was just kind of a metabolic switch. I think you go from a high carb diet to a high fat diet, and like your body's going to struggle a little bit. And most people report that when they're even just doing a ketogenic diet with no exercise. So for me, it was just when I started it, I was kind of in an off season, which was good in hindsight, because had I been trying to do like a big training block and had flipped that stuff on its head, it probably would have been a much different experience. I was able to kind of play around with it a little bit due to the off season and kind of put the foundation in place when I wasn't doing as much running, and the running I was doing was very low intensity. And then, then it just became like, well, here we have like a lot of research in like the ketogenic high fat, low carb world, but they're more skewed towards things like epilepsy or type 2 diabetes and stuff that's maybe not necessarily performance based. So then it came like, well, how does my lifestyle impact what I'm doing within the kind of macronutrient profiles, and kind of figuring out like where the place would be for the carbohydrates I do eat and how often, and figuring out all the timing with that stuff so that I could kind of maximize my workouts without necessarily, going high carb or staying strict keto.
Yeah. So when you first started switching, did you notice like recovery times improving or anything non-performance related? As far as like how you felt, joint pain, inflammation, recovery, et cetera?
Yeah. The thing that I noticed the quickest was sleep. So, which I think is interesting because I don't think everyone reports it. Some people report the opposite. So like when I switched, I started sleeping through the night real consistently, which is kind of one of the drivers for me to look at. One of the reasons why I was looking to kind of change some stuff was because historically I'd been a really good sleeper. Like in high school and college, I'd sleep 8 to 9 hours a night straight through, basically. Maybe I'd wake up once to go to the bathroom if I was like overhydrated or something like that. But then when I got to that phase of training, when I was doing more ultra marathons and the training was just higher volume than I had done historically, I'd be waking up 3 or 4 times a night. And, I would found myself blocking off like 10 plus hours a night just so I could make sure I got 8 hours, because I knew I was going to wake up and then need 30 minutes to fall back asleep.
Right.
So the thing that once I had been doing it for like maybe a little over a week or two, I started sleeping through the night consistently. So that's kind of maybe what drove me to stick with it in the first place, was like seeing some of that stuff kind of clear up. And energy levels too. Like, I wouldn't say I was like shot out of a cannon or anything like that energy level wise, but I was almost trying to avoid that, because when I was on a high carb diet, it was just kind of like a roller coaster where you'd have tons of energy or you'd feel like you want to just lay down and take a nap. Right. So it was a little more even keel, which I think was good for me and my lifestyle. And so then when that stuff started kind of triggering early on, it kind of motivated me to at least figure out a way to make it a semblance of that type of a lifestyle work nutritionally for the running and racing stuff too.
Yeah. So obviously, outside of fueling during the race, your diet changed probably.
Yeah.
So like what was your nutrition like, and then also your race strategy and fueling strategy pre-change? Like what did that look like?
Yeah, so I was doing probably in the neighborhood of 60, maybe sometimes up to 70% carbohydrate. And then maybe
what type of foods was it?
A lot of kind of quote unquote healthy high carb foods. So like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, that sort of stuff. A lot of potatoes, a lot of fruits, a lot of starchy vegetable. I guess that'd be potatoes, but like, I didn't eat like a ton of junk food or anything like that. I wasn't like guzzling sports drinks and sugar and things like that. So I always had a mind for healthy eating more or less. And when I got into endurance, I just looked at, well, what's endurance protocol nutritionally? And especially back then when you look into it, it was going to be high carb is all you'd see. So then once you kind of have that framework, then it's like, well, what are the healthy high carb options? And, then most people are turning to like whole food type stuff, which is what I basically did.
What about in the race?
In the race, that's when I was using more kind of like engineered fuels, like sports drinks, gels, basically straight sugar. You're battling a few things with race day because you don't want to tax your digestive system too much by throwing too many complexities at it. Right. So you almost have to kind of bite the bullet and taking the straight rocket fuel on race day.
Got it. And how did that change when you first switched to a low carb approach as far as nutrition and then fueling strategies?
Yeah, so race fueling, the types of fuels stayed pretty consistent. It's just I did a massive reduction in how much.
Got it.
So when I was high carb, I was targeting maybe 300 to 400 calories per hour during races, and then when I switched to a higher fat approach, I was getting down under 200 on a pretty regular basis. Now it's pretty rare that I'll get up to 200. Maybe if it's like an A race and the weather's pretty temperate, then I'll try to flex up to 200 calories an hour. But for any race that's not kind of a peak, which is basically 2 or 3 times a year, sometimes then I'm even lower than that, like getting down to like 100 calories an hour or something like that. So it's night and day difference in how your stomach and your digestion feels. Like I would be finishing 50 milers and I just feel like my stomach was like a balloon that was expanding throughout the course. And then now it's like you still feel like pretty decent digestively when you can kind of minimize that fuel intake during the event itself.
Got it. So you're still intaking carbohydrate during the race.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the way I look at it is during the race, I want to avoid digestion if I can. So like I'm going to lean heavily on burning like onboard fat. And, even the leanest endurance athletes, myself included, like are going to have enough body fat to get me through a race that I'm doing, at least at the distances I'm running currently. So to eat fat during a race is, I wouldn't say it's not useless, because there's definitely other mechanisms that are kind of affecting the way you perform when you're eating something in general. Right. But I'm going to try to eat a lot of the fat post race and replace what I burnt, because you can bypass the digestive system. That's a win, especially if it gets hot out.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So that's your strategy then, is use body fat instead of so you're not messing around with like MCT or ketones or anything like that, or have you done that as well?
I've played around a little bit with ketones. I'm going to probably play around with a little more this year. But under the assumption too, that's also something I'm having to digest. So, you have to it's kind of a fine line, because like you want to eat as much as you can get away with, but you also don't want to cross that line and find yourself spending time on the sideline, losing your nutrition, puking it up, having to come out the other end or something like that from overstepping that line. So when you introduce anything different, you got to kind of play around with it, kind of find out where that line is for you and try to stay underneath it.
Got it. So what about your food? How do your food switch? So eating, starchy vegetables, things like that, super clean. Now, how is it, when you first did it versus now?
Yeah, so I've had a few different kind of phases, I guess. They've all had a similar macronutrient profile, but I've done things as much as like more kind of plant-based, high fat. I've never done like strict vegan or anything like that, but I've tried phases of that where I'm limiting the amount of meat. I've done things where it's mostly animal products, and then everything in between. Right now I'm kind of, I try to focus on things like, well, what are things that like animal products do better? What are things that maybe a vegetable product would be better at? And then try to pick and choose from there within the macronutrient stuff.
So how are you finding that those tools differ for you?
So I think like when I'm looking at like meat consumption, if I'm getting fatty cuts of meat, like that's just a superior form of protein versus any type of plant protein. And there's going to be some vitamins that are going to be better in meat products, like vitamin B, iron, things like that. All important stuff for endurance athletes. And then there's like other things that, I could probably get better sources of from plants, like vitamin C and stuff like that, a little bit of fiber, things like that, I'm going to use within the macronutrient profile I'm looking for from that side of stuff.
Okay. So are you training every single day at this point to just keep capacity up?
Yeah, for the most part. Like if I have like a peak race, I'll usually take like a week off completely or so afterwards, and then just start kind of running with no real like structure for about a week and feel out how my body's recovering, and then I'll start building up for whatever else I'm doing next. And it is kind of like an interesting look where most people, I think their athletic pursuits are fairly consistent from day to day. They're not deviating too far from their schedule, whereas for me it's like I might have a huge training day of like 30 miles, 35 miles or something like that. And the next day I'm not running at all because I'm recovering from that. So you can get like a pretty big variance in kind of what I'm doing. But usually over the course of the year, the last 10 years or so, I've averaged maybe about 5,000 miles upwards to maybe 5,500 miles in a year's time, which is about 100 miles a week on average.
And you're doing most of your races on tracks?
No, not most of them. Whenever I'm targeting to just try to see how fast I can run a 100 mile, like if that's my goal, then I'm going to seek out something like that because you can just control so many of the variables.
Got it. Okay. And that's what the world record was on?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. It was actually a pretty cool setup. It was at the Pettit Center in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is the Olympic training facility over there.
Oh, wow.
So it's actually built for the speed skating rink, and they just happened to also build a running track around that. And so it made for a really nice spot because it was like 60 degrees, no sun, no wind, pretty much control everything.
Perfect,
yeah.
Yeah. So did you go into that with the intention like, okay, today's the day, I'll bust it?
Yeah, it was kind of funny because I was actually technically supposed to, at the beginning of the year when I planned out my schedule, was peaking for a race after that one. And that one kind of popped up after I'd already established my racing calendar for the year, but it just looked like such a good venue. I didn't really want to pass up on it. So when I started training for it, I was a little skeptical if I'd be ready in time because I kind of had an abbreviated time frame. But once I kind of got into the meat of my training schedule for like the fitness was there. So I would say maybe about 3-4 weeks out, I started getting pretty confident. Like, all right, I think if I have a good day, I could get under the world record at this one. And yeah, it happened to play out nicely for me.
So you weren't even planning to do it?
Not originally. It's like now that I'm living in Phoenix, I've just got so much access to different types of running terrain that it gets a lot easier to peak for different stuff. So one of the biggest hurdles with ultramarathoning is if you fall in love with a type of racing that you don't have access to in training, it's really hard to peak for it because you don't have that specific terrain. And when I was living in the Midwest, there's a lot of flat options, not a whole lot of like hilly, mountainous options. So it just made sense to peak for flatter stuff. Now I'm in Phoenix, so like I have options to go and do, like there's a route out near my house where you can run for 7.5 miles straight up for 5,000 feet and then come back down. So you can really get a good climbing and descending workout in there. So last year, the first half of the year, I was training for the San Diego 100 mile. And that was like the first half of my season was kind of skewed towards that. And then when I recovered from that, I was going to do the second half of the year was going to be more flatter, faster, runnable stuff.
Got it. The San Diego one was hilly and more terrain?
Yeah, kind of technical, hilly mountain course in San Diego. So it was a little different from what I've normally done, but it was a blast to kind of train for and race that one.
So the 100 mile in Wisconsin on a track. How do you, like you talked about before, a mental game. And sometimes people just have a harder mental toughness than others. Like I couldn't imagine running 15 laps on the track and not going crazy, man. Like what's going through your head? Hour 6, hour 7, mile 58.
Yeah.
Just block it out and you're in a meditative state. Are you listening to podcasts still when you're doing the race days? Like what's
kind of all the above. I definitely think you want to be compartmentalizing the race day into like different sections. And if you find yourself thinking of mile 100 at mile 5, you're going to be mentally taxed way before. Yeah. So you kind of have to go in there with like, here's where I want to be at certain points and then kind of hyper focus on those. So like maybe I'm thinking about mile 20 as my first goal of where I want to be there. And you're not even thinking beyond that. You're just saying, okay, this is the pace I know I can handle. Make sure I'm doing my getting my fueling right and hitting my paces, and I'll worry about anything after that. And you definitely get sucked in sometimes to having a negative thought processes where your mind kind of wanders in the wrong direction. Like specifically at that one, I think it was around mile 40. I was just kind of calculating numbers in my head, and I was like, well, I'll probably get to 50 miles at this time, 100 kilometers at that time. And I was like, I don't know if I can double back and do that much and still get under the world record. And, so I had to kind of talk myself off that ledge, so to speak, a little bit and just say, okay, just let's get some laps that are within the range you're targeting. And just, after that, you just do that. And before you make any decision at mile 40 to kind of, scale back or slow down, let's see where things go. And ultimately you end up, I think what works really well for me is when I'm in a race like that, say like 40 miles into a 100 miler, you can think of it as, I got 60 miles to go. That's an eternity. Or you can look at it and say, there's a 4-month buildup to this where I spent like way more time for that. So do I really want to throw that all away by kind of cashing in early and saying like, I'm not having a good day today? And I think when you put yourself in that position, it's a lot harder to say like, yeah, it's just not my day. And then you can kind of maybe push past some mental barriers a little better than you can. And some of that just comes with experience too. I've had, since 2013, I'd done a few of those type of races. So you start to kind of recognize like when is it just like your mind trying to say you should stop because you're kind of doing something ridiculous. So like it's, you got to kind of override that or bypass like your mind's kind of wanting you to kind of stop.
Yeah. Do you get into like a meditative state in some of these races, or is it just thinking and calculating times and like consuming information? Like, how do you?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm definitely consuming information. It helps pass the time, but you want to be careful how much of that you do too, because that can be kind of a mental burden if you're just constantly watching every lap split. So what I do is I try to I'll watch a couple of lap splits just to make sure I'm within the range I'm targeting. And then once I kind of know that, I like kind of take assessment of how it feels, like what is the effort at those splits so that I kind of know I'm doing it. Then I'll stop watching for a while and just kind of like zone out or just kind of like meditate or get in kind of a flow state where I don't even really acknowledge that I'm on a track. Like picture myself out running a route back home somewhere or out on the trails or something like that. And then I'll spot check the pace every once in a while to make sure I'm still in range. And if I am, I just kind of go back to that kind of meditative flow state. And if I'm off, then I have to kind of recalibrate and bring things back into the range I'm targeting.
Do you, I mean, at these races and these levels, do you start, is it a physical thing at a certain point where you just like, you need to sort of fight what your body's telling you, just like, Zach, stop, man. Like, this is too much. Like my ankles, my shins hurt. Like, stop. Like, and it's just like you push through that, or you train past that. And it's just like, you just sort of just, you just keep going and it's the same thing one lap after another.
Yeah, I think there's a few things at play. It's always going to get physically difficult. So the way I sometimes describe it is when things are going well, the difference between it becoming a great day and just like a solid day is like I can push past those like weird little things like, oh, my quads are hurting or my ankles are hurting like maybe 2 or 3 more times than I would normally be able to. And then you find yourself with like a PR or, a good rate or great race. But then, there's other things too that can kind of impact how badly your body's feeling. Like if you get dehydrated or you get behind on nutrition, or if it's hotter out and you're not doing enough topical cooling and stuff like that, then
do you just put ice on yourself?
Yeah, like cold water. It's pretty amazing how much of the difference that can make, even if it's like one of the kind of coolest examples I did this race just this last December where I was targeting 100-kilometer time, and it started getting a little warm and sunny during kind of the maybe 2/3 of the way in. And so I started like dumping ice water on my head and just kind of cooling off. And then when I looked at the data afterwards, you could see where my heart rate was slightly climbing up, even though my pace was pretty consistent. And then once I started doing that topical cooling, you saw my heart rate kind of creep back down. So there's a lot of kind of weird little things that can impact that too, where if you're not taking care of yourself or things aren't going as well, like logistically, that, that those leg pains and the negative stuff is just kind of amplified. And that's going to be a tougher day to kind of get past that if it's amplifying above and beyond the norm.
So when you were about to break the world record, you probably were, I mean, I'm sure you knew a couple miles out, right? As far as pace goes, or did you like hit the gas, the last like couple miles to really get under it? Or were you like, okay, at 10 miles out, that you're going to get this?
Yeah, it was interesting because I negative split it, meaning I ran the second 50 milers faster than the first 50 miles. So my first 50 miles was 5 hours and 40 minutes. My second 50 was 5 hours and 38. And I would say when I got to 100 kilometers, I felt like, okay, I've got a really good look at this, because I actually got to 100 kilometers a few minutes faster than I had projected myself to back at mile 40. So I was kind of like gaining momentum more so than losing it. And that was motivating. And at that point, I'm 62 and a half miles in. My longest long run for that buildup was a 32 and a half miler. So at that point, I just thought, if I can get to like 68, then I just have one more long run. And then I'm kind of in a position where like you can kind of let a little bit of a weight off your shoulders, where now I'm not thinking about running 100 miles today. I'm thinking about just doing one more long run, which I'd been doing like basically every weekend for the last few weeks. And so when I got to that kind of 68-mile mark, I just kind of took inventory. I was like, all right, I feel good enough where I think I can do one more solid long run. I would say maybe by the time I got to 80, I was pretty confident, unless something really bad happened, that I'd break it. And then it was just kind of like staying on top of things, making sure I didn't do anything that was gonna compromise how good I had been feeling at that point. And I was able to do that. So I didn't really have any big lows from basically, mid 60s to the finish. And it was that's probably what allowed me mostly to kind of speed up at the end there. I was actually running some of my faster miles in the last 10. So it was kind of a new, unique experience, but it was also like an experience that I think I was able to do because I've had it go the other way before, where, you get to mile 80 I'm on pace, and then the wheels start kind of getting a little wobbly, and you start slowly watch the record kind of drift away. So it's hard to kind of like, you always have that in the back of your mind, even if you're feeling pretty confident.
Yeah. And so, what was it feeling like when you hit the record? So you've been training for how many years at this point to get this?
Yeah, so I guess about 6. I'd done the first one I did was in that December 2013, so this was August of 2019, so just under 6 years. Had been kind of about the time frame that I was focusing on trying to get under the world record. So when I hit that felt great. It was interesting though, because you get a little greedy almost. Like when I got to like mile 80, I was looking at my splits, and I was like thinking like, I could probably get maybe 7 or 8 minutes under. And then you see your splits start to speed up a little bit. And, I think someone on the track told me around mile like 96 or 97, like, oh, you're on pace to run 11 hours and 20 minutes. So I'm like, no, I'm going to run 11 hours and 19 minutes. So like, it's really weird when you cross that spot and you can kind of let that go, because now all of a sudden it's done. But it was also interesting there too, because I had a little over 40 minutes left before I hit 12 hours then. And in my mind, I'm like, well, I got to keep going, even if it's a lot slower, just to, better my 12-hour world record. So I slowed down quite a bit. I went from running I averaged 6:48 pace for the 100 miles. I was probably running closer to 6:20 pace near the end there. And then once I hit 100 miles, I ratcheted that back to 8.5-minute miles, and it was just kind of waddling around the track more or less.
Well, a sprint for most people, but a waddle for you. Yeah. So, I mean, very few people work for something that hard over the course of 6 years and actually get it. What's the mentality after that? Is it just okay, on to the next thing? Where are your sights now?
Yeah, it's interesting, because I think my thought with this has always been I'm less concerned or less focused, I think, on being a world record holder. I mean, that is what it is. I mean, I won't lie, it's cool to be a world record holder, but someone's going to come along and break that. Yeah. And then what's left is what you had personally. And for me, I think it was deciding this is something I want to do, and having a lot of reasons to maybe bail on it over the course of that 6 years, but kind of just sticking with it and saying, okay, what can I do to kind of fix this, or what can I do to improve on certain little aspects so I could ultimately have a day like I did at the end of 2019. So that's kind of my takeaway, is just no matter what, I can always kind of look at that as an experience in my life where I picked a goal and stuck to it, even when it got difficult, and, maybe doubted that it was possible at times and things like that. And, my first thought when I broke it though was, how much faster can I go? So I tell myself as long as I keep thinking that, I'll keep doing them. So so I'm actually signed up for a 100-miler in London in April. That's going to be hopefully conducive to running fast. So I'll probably try to target breaking that time if I can there, and see if I can cross the finish line and say, okay, I can't go any faster than that time, to focus on a different, distance.
So it's still about getting that time better right now. That's sort of your main goal.
Yeah, I don't feel like I've run my fastest 100-miler yet, and I could prove myself wrong. If I end up finishing my career with that being my fastest 100-miler, I won't be disappointed. But if I stop now, I'll always think, well, I think maybe I could have run 10 minutes faster if I would have just had a couple more things pan out just right, or have, just a slightly better day. So it's until I know, I won't stop.
Got it. Okay. So, you say your career in this stuff, and is there a point where, how old are you now?
34.
Got it. And then is there a point where at this age, it's sort of your capacity starts dwindling a little bit, or is it different for everybody, or is it sort of
Yeah, it's hard to know. I think you can maybe stretch out your timeline a little bit if you're doing more mountain stuff, because that can be a little more strength. So you can still build a lot. Some of these real strong people on the planet are in their 40s. So it's those those type of races you can maybe do for a little bit longer. There's examples. There's a guy, Jeff Browning, who has a similar nutrition plan to me, I think he's turning 49 this year, and he's been top 10 at Western States the last 4 years. And so he's just, he's defying all the age laws, I guess.
Yeah, he's the Tom Brady of running.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good way to look at him, I think. But yeah, for me, I think there's some things that I'd like to do too. There's a timed event, the 24-hour, where you just see how far you can get in 24 hours. I think is really cool. The course or the world record for that, I think, is one of the stoutest world records in the sport. And I think that would be a fun one to peak for. The guy who has it, Giannis Kouros, he did it when he was 40. So it's one of those things like, I also realize running for 24 hours versus just under 12, it requires a lot less speed. So it's not something I necessarily need to be like hyper focused on at this point. And it might be something that I can transition towards after I feel like I've kind of taken a step back from being able to run fast for 100 miles.
Got it. Yeah. So, I mean, the other side of the coin, I know there's like stuff like bad water and things like that that is like super intense. Like, do you have interest in doing, like, do you do things like that, or are you just sort of like your 100-mile kind of guy?
Yeah, no, I think those are cool events. I think there's another one like that kind of out in Greece called the Spartathlon, which is actually the race I was going to be peaking for this last year. That's a 153-mile race that I think is really cool. I want to get out there and take another crack at that race down the road. Badwater is an interesting event, although I used to be really stoked about that particular race as like kind of this is one I definitely have to do. But then you kind of look at just the logistics of that event, and it seems like it's just as much like who can create a microclimate around their runner can sometimes be the bigger driver than like the actual like self-sufficiency, I guess, that you're gonna have. And I mean, every one of these races you're leaning on other people, but like that one is especially dependent on others. So it's a little less intriguing for me because of that particular aspect, I guess. But
so do you have like a team of people that help you out in race day?
Yeah, usually.
Like mixing you up beverages and just like giving you this ice water, and like what does that look like?
Yeah, for like one of these track events, it's like, you have like a little folding table you set up and you have all your stuff there, and basically like I have a general protocol that I'll let your crew know, so they'll be expecting that that's probably what they'll do. But one of the reasons you do a race like that on a track is so you can deviate from that if you need to or want to. So then basically I'll just be telling them like, this is what I want, and then like a lap later I probably have it. And then you get races like some of these trail ones, like when I did the San Diego 100, where you can have a crew out there, but they can maybe only go to certain aid stations. So you're doing a lot of self-supporting stuff off of aid station tables and things like that too, where you want to fill your own bottle and grab what you want off the aid station table, or have a drop bag, or wear a pack and bring stuff that you're going to use. And those are a little more, logistically difficult, which is one of the fun parts about it, is because everyone's got to deal with it too. So it just makes it a little more complicated for everyone.
Part of the game.
It is, yeah.
And so the one in London, is it another track?
That one's on a track, yeah.
Good luck, man.
Thanks.
So you said you only trained 30-ish miles for, like, that was the longest run you had before you did the 100-mile?
Yeah, usually once I get above around like 30-ish miles in training, I'll just jump in a race and use it as like kind of a build up. So like I'm really lucky in Arizona. There's a race organization called Aravaipa, and they put on like, I think it's like 34 events now. So like if I really wanted to do, say, like if I want to bridge that gap between like my long run and the 100 miles, I can just jump in like a 100K or a 50 miler, and then just make sure I'm kind of like holding back a little bit, so I'm not leaving my goal race out there on the training day, so to speak. So that's usually what I'll do if I'm going to go further than that. And a lot of times when I'm doing like a 100-miler, I'm building up to it. So I'll probably do some shorter distance races before that. Like this one in particular, I'm actually going out to New Zealand in a week and to do a 102-kilometer race. So that'll be kind of like my longest long run for the 100-miler in April.
And do you go there? Do you like go a couple weeks early or a week early to acclimate to the time zone, so like that, or you just sort of like roll into it all jet lagged? And
yeah, if it was like an A race, so like the races I've traveled the furthest for, like World 100 kilometers, and those ones I'll usually try to get out like at least 5 days, maybe a week early, just so you can kind of reacclimate. New Zealand's not too bad because it's basically, they're 20 hours ahead of us. So it's almost like you just lose a day. You don't really change your kind of circadian rhythm as much as you would. But it is interesting. I've done it both ways. Like earlier this year, I flew out to Maryland to do a race and got there at like 7:00 the night before, and that race went really well. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
So, I mean, what are you doing to take care of your body right now? Are you just a freak recovering athlete and this is not an issue for you? But obviously sleep and nutrition, eat really clean. Like, what are the other things that you're doing to like take care of your own, little machine here?
Yeah. I think I'll do like strength work, mobility work, and things like that, just to make sure like the imbalances you can get from running, especially flat.
And then going the one direction too.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's just a lot of like, one thing I recognized a few years ago was like just the different types of weird kind of tightnesses you get from running, that type of stuff. Like I had really tight ankles, low mobility in my ankles, and tight hips. So like I'll do a lot of mobility stuff that focuses on that. I also realized like my posterior chain was a lot weaker, some muscle imbalances. So I started doing a lot more like strength work, focusing on like glutes and hamstrings. So like kettlebell stuff, squats, deadlifts, that sort of stuff. And those are kind of just like kind of strength balancing things. I'll do a phase of training too, where I'm doing short intervals just to kind of build that strength and power up a little bit so that my body's a little more balanced and a little more prepared to kind of handle the rigors when I get into like the more specific stuff for the events I'm training for, which just tend to be low intensity, long days out there on the track, road, or trail.
Got it. And you said before that, like was it Tim Olson?
Yeah.
Before, and then you started doing this like 2013. How many, people in this range of endurance athletes like are switching to more of a low carb approach to fuel themselves? Like, is it becoming way more popular or?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely getting more popular. It's hard to know because like there's just such as a huge like population of people who aren't like breaking records or winning races or ending up on the podium, and I think they're a really interesting population in terms of utilizing a strategy like this when they're not necessarily trying to optimize performance. They're trying to optimize life and then also enjoy the whatever activity they choose to do, which sometimes happens to be ultra marathons. In terms of like the top end of the fields, I guess it's still dominant by high carb for sure, but we're seeing more guys and gals kind of play around with it a little bit. Like this year, they do a thing at the end of the year where they vote like a lot of the people who are like in the media and race directions to vote on like the top runners in North America. And this year, I was 2, Jeff Browning was 5, and this guy Jason Schlarb was 10, and all 3 of us kind of do a version of a high-fat, low-carb diet. Mike McKnight is a guy he won this thing called the Triple Crown of 200s, where it's 200-plus mile races, all within like, I think it's within like an 8-week time frame. It's basically a month in between each one. And he won all of them and broke the record for that. And he's probably the strictest in terms of reducing his carbohydrate out of all of us. And I think his focus is longer distance stuff yet. So he can probably get away with going a little closer to keto than someone like me or Jeff or Jason Schlarb could do.
Okay. And then is everybody doing carbohydrates during, or are some people doing
carbs
during?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think most of us that are kind of doing a version of a high fat, low carb diet are doing just lower levels of carbohydrate during. I know Jeff does. Jeff is probably the other one who's more outspoken about it and shares a lot of what he does. So he'll usually kind of target maybe a couple 100 calories an hour from some sports fuels and like some fruit and stuff on aid station tables.
And then are you doing any sort of like carb up beforehand the race at all, like a day or a couple hours before, or is it just like in race only?
Yeah, I'll do a little bit maybe when I get about 36 hours or so out from the race. I'll start bringing a little bit of carbohydrates back, similar to what I would do during kind of my peak training around big workouts. And but before that, like I'll usually start planning like a week out. So like a week out, I'll go like really low, like strict keto low for about 4 or 5 days. And then I'll bring back a little bit of carbohydrate a couple days before. Morning of, I stay away from carbs for the most part because there's no reason for me really to trigger like a glycolytic response by consuming carbohydrates. The morning of a race, I want to start burning high levels of fat. So I'll eat like a fattier breakfast and then usually start kind of reintroducing carbohydrates in a more significant way about 30, maybe 45 minutes into the race.
Got it. So, and then do you ramp up over time, or is it just like pretty much at that point you're at the 100 to 200 calories an hour?
Yeah.
Is it an hour?
Yeah, pretty much about an hour. I think at the Pettit Center, I averaged around 40 to 45 grams. So that would be right around 200 calories an hour. And I was basically doing it every 30 minutes. I would get like a bottle that had like 20 to 25 grams in it. And I would just sip at that for maybe about 15 minutes. And then, at the next 30-minute interval, grab another one. And it worked really well that day. So
you were speaking before. I mean, you were teaching before.
Yeah.
And now you're doing a little bit more speaking podcasts that are like, how are you feeling your time besides running right now?
Yeah. A lot of that stuff I do, coach endurance athletes, mostly ultra marathoners, but I'll get some like sub ultra marathon distance athletes too. Podcasting, going to things like this at the metabolic health conference. I've done some work for some of my sponsors in the past too, so it's always fun to kind of get more involved with them besides just saying, oh, here's my training and racing schedule and thanks for the product and the paycheck.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I know you said earlier, like, you have learned this sort of mental toughness of working for this goal for 6 years and hitting it. Like, how have you seen that translate to other areas of your life? Do you think it's just like way easier to get stuff done now? Because like, oh, I trained for 6 years to break the world record and I did it and I hit it and that, push back all these mental barriers. Like, do you find it's easier to spot mental barriers in other areas of your life now? Or like, how has that helped shift things for you?
Yeah, I think it kind of, for two things I like to lean on it from. One is just patience. I think like a lot of stuff, you can rush into things sometimes too, and then get a little discouraged if they don't happen right away. So sometimes if I'm trying to like get better at something or work on something and it's not clicking right away or it's not going exactly according to plan, you can kind of take a step back and say, okay, I just need to like reassess where I'm at now and decide where I want to be and find out where the next logical step is, versus trying to get it all in one swing, so to speak. So that's I think a real helpful one. But then just knowing like how much you can do if you just stick to something too, I think helps. Right. Like you're just not going to give up on stuff as quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you said earlier too about how you just figure out, what can I tweak now? What can I do now? Yeah, okay, I'm not where I'm at. What am I going to do? I think so many people just give up when they hit a wall and like, okay, well, I guess I'm going to go do something else now.
Yeah, and I think it teaches you to kind of enjoy the process too. So like when I look back at a lot of that stuff, like you can glean from, it's more than just like, okay, I had that one great day and that was the payoff. It's like, it was also pretty cool just to see like, oh, here's the incremental progress over time, or this is what, when I do this type of training, I see this improvement at about this rate. And you can transition that into other things in life too, where like you start to enjoy the process of getting to something as opposed to just looking at this end goal and thinking that's where I have to be.
Yeah, process, man. It's everything. Journey.
Yeah.
I think that and that's why I was curious as far as like, do you just have a new thing now or like you're just going to keep finding ones? I mean, I think that's where I find where people are the happiest and most successful is like, they don't just, hit this one goal and they're done.
Right.
You just pick something else and keep going. And then the process is what is the fun part.
It is. Yeah. And I think like, if you don't, then you find yourself, I think you just end depressed probably. Cause then it's like, well, what are you going to do with your time? And what are you gonna enjoy if you can't? So yeah, that's always the endless pursuit. Like always have enough irons in the fire, so there's something interesting, and then but not so many that you can't get any one of them done.
Well, I mean, thanks for sharing your story, man. I know you have somewhere to go quick after this. So, is there anywhere you want to point people as far as where they can follow your stuff?
Sure. Yeah. First of all, thanks for having me on. It was great to chat. The one-stop shop would be my website at zachbitter.com. I'm most active on Instagram and Twitter. Instagram is at ZachBitter and Twitter is at ZBitter.
That's good. Thanks, Zach. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Natural State Podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, I'd really appreciate you heading over to whatever service you're listening to this podcast on, dropping me a 5-star review and your thoughts on the show. This helps us get discovered by more people and spreading the good gospel of health. And if you want to stay plugged into all of my self-health experiments, recent research in books that I'm reading and my interpretations of those things, products that I'm testing, and thoughts on all things related to health, check out my free weekly newsletter called The Feed. You can sign up for that at dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. That's dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. Thanks again for tuning in and your support of the Natural State Podcast.